brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.
Sopheap Pich is one of Cambodia's most exciting and internationally recognised artists. His signature rattan and bamboo sculptures are shaping the Southeast Asian contemporary art world.
Sopheap's someone who's so clear about his process and his reason for being an artist.
A lot of his works are so incredibly touchable because of their voluptuous forms.
I think that comes back to this idea of this very intellectualized exercise of trying to tap into something that's very natural and deep within us, and that's our connection to the material, connection to the earth, and the connection to the things that make us who we are.
There must be a world that I can live in. There must be a little place for me. That's always been my aspiration, to find that little world.
Sopheap was born in a small village near Battambang, Cambodia, in 1971. It was here where he learnt the traditional metalsmith methods passed on by his father. Techniques that are so embedded in his work today.
My father always taught me, if you're hungry, you gotta go and find food. So he taught me to make my own fish hook, put a worm on it, and actually caught my first fish with it, so he was pretty proud of me.
Sopheap later adapted his father's traditional craftsman skills into mesmerising objects. In 2002, he sculpted Mountain Spring, a form that alludes to a Khmer fishing trap.
So these shapes are reminiscent of things from maybe my childhood. Like if you go around the countryside, you see people putting a sort of haystacks. It has this shape, this kind of mountain shape. Also, people make fish traps that are tall. They usually have openings here. They put a bait inside, and then fish swim into it, and then they cannot come out.
He really wanted to make work that reflected his own experience in Cambodia, using local techniques, which he learned from his father as a boy, so making fish traps, weaving baskets.
Although Sopheap's childhood was spent playing with marbles and fish traps, he grew up during the brutal rule of the Khmer Rouge, which claimed the lives of nearly 2 million people.
My father had no hope that the country is going to get any better. The only way to have a better life in his mind was to get us to a place where we can have, proper education. So he was willing to risk everything for that.
His mother carried his younger brother on her back, and his father held his hand as they crossed the border to Thailand. These memories later found their ways into his installation titled 1979.
It was almost this post-apocalyptic kind of landscape. So there were things that were left behind, like binoculars, there was bomb casings, the buffaloes that were in the field. So all of these are kind of scattered around the room.
For him as a child, they were very strange. And so in the installation, he produced them at such a large, exaggerated scale as would a child see them.
At the end of the installation was his first Buddha piece that was inspired by a temple.
What's significant about that temple was that all inside the wall, there was like red spots everywhere. I figured that maybe people was killed in the temple. I mean, it was blood. So to symbolize that, I made my first Buddha.
It's a really beautiful, minimalist Buddha, but Sopheap has left the strands dangling towards the bottom, and the ends of the rattan are actually tipped in red to suggest blood.
Leaving the violence behind him, Sopheap arrived at Kawi Dung, a refugee camp in Thailand. It was here, around 12 years old, where he had his first encounter with art. He was mesmerised by a watercolour painting of a typical Cambodian landscape drawn by a child.
When you see something that beautiful for the first time in your life, it just has an imprint on your memory.
Sopheap immigrated to the US in 1984. The world of art quickly faded out of Sopheap's life when his father decided that medicine would be his calling.
Being the eldest son, my father expected a lot out of me. He just figured, my son is going to pay me back in some manner or other, and that was not to be an artist.
But Sopheap's medical career was short-lived. In 1991, he enrolled in painting at the University of Massachusetts, breaking traditions to follow his dreams.
Being sort of an outsider, didn't have many friends, didn't know how to make many friends, art was a kind of escape from the real world, and I knew that that's what I was going to do no matter what.
Sopheap's early paintings expressed his memories of his country and the politics of that time. He painted portraits of the prisoners at Tuol Sleng prison, the victims of the Khmer Rouge regime.
I drew it with just a bamboo pen and a brush and India ink.
Leaving behind a country suffering from violence and injustice was something that deeply affected him.
It was most just trying to pull something out of myself so that I didn't have to deal with it, in the long run. Subsequently, I moved out of that personal stage and I became somebody else.
And so, in 2004, Sopheap looked for inspiration elsewhere, his medical school lessons. With an axe, a butcher's knife, and his old textbooks, he embarked on his first ever sculpture, a pair of lungs.
I just looked at the medical book and started making drawings based on these inside forms, the stomach, the liver, the lungs. I just started making a frame of a pair of lungs because I was smoking a lot.
The director of the French Cultural Center at that time told Sopheap that the work has a beautiful austerity, it's very modern in its form, and it was when the artist took this advice that his signature style was born.
His experiments with a piece of rattan and a knife accidentally led to the start of his international art career.
My very first sculpture, Silence. And then my second sculpture, which is Cycle. Those two work defines who I am as a person. They have dictated the way I work ever since I made them. Since I was a child, it was always the hunger, was always the demon, the beast. It's just a circular kind of motion, and I start thinking about, family connections and cycle of hunger, to sound a bit cliche-ish. Yeah, a lot of my work has to do with duality. There's always a kind of two thing connecting to each other.
Sopheap's early sculptures were representations of internal organs, so they were clearly influenced by his pre-med studies in the US, but also, I think, a way of thinking about human experience, human connection, the relationship between inside and outside.
Sopheap's experimental methods and the ability to make these subtle connections is what makes his art so unique. Coming up next, we show you how his bamboo sculptures go from tree to art. Sopheap Pich is most known for his organic geometrical structures. His work explores cycles and connections, drawing from his memories of childhood during the Khmer Rouge, his search for belonging in the US, and even his medical school books. In 2002, Sopheap returned back to Cambodia, to Phnom Penh, a city he'd never been to before.
I fell in love with it. My senses were just exploding. I smelled the building, I smelled the dirt, I smelled the air, and everything about it was just delicious.
Since moving back to Cambodia, Sopheap's art began to reflect his hybrid identity. His 2008 sculpture, Jewel, explores the connections and collision of his two worlds.
The idea of duality, there's so many layers to it. Being someone that was born here and then, going somewhere else, coming back. I guess you're always kind of walking in two different worlds.
It was this sculpture that set his principle of non-wastage, a practice that's intrinsic to his art making. Jewel was made by using the entire ends of 4 bamboo trees, not throwing anything away but the branches.
It's not possible to use every single thing, but to use the most of the things that you're using, I think it's very important.
Rattan and bamboo grow in the tropics and are one of the fastest growing plants in the world. But for Sopheap, they were not only the most accessible and convenient, but also the most affordable materials.
I wasn't born with a lot of money, and I didn't start making art with a lot of money, so I have to choose the cheaper material. It's just simply out of necessity that we use it. It becomes, and it looks like choice later on, because we've grown to accept it and love it.
He first worked with rattan as a sculptural material, and for him that was a major turning point. It was, I think, for him an intellectual leap, and he kind of found what it was that worked for him as an artist.
When you think about these traditional wicker furniture that we used to have, I think those familiar sensations are probably quite contextual for Southeast Asian audiences.
I was riding my bicycle around and just pretty much across the block from where we were living, there was a rattan shop, so I figured why not just walk in there and ask them to buy a few rattan trees.
With Sopheap's newly born trademark, his ethos of non-wastage, came a new one: no cutting corners.
I think part of making a sculpture is to make everything yourself. It's not important that you get it done faster. It's not important that it should be easier.
For Sopheap, an important part of making his sculpture is to choose which bamboo or rattan to use. He takes us to Chambok Mias, where he shows us how he picks his material.
Looking at the bamboo, you could see, like, what is the difference between this bamboo and that bamboo? Which one do we prefer? And myself, personally, I get a little inspiration from that for future works. Like, for example, at one point we were cutting bamboo, and I saw all the shell, all the patterns, like, you know, on the outside of the bamboo for the first time, you know, because I'm right there next to it. It forced me to look at it.
For this kind of strenuous work, Sopheap relies on the support of his team.
It's lonely to work alone, yeah. And as you get older, you don't want to be lifting stuff and cutting stuff. The stuff that you don't want to do physically, you have other people who are more capable of doing it. I mean, they help me more than I help them, for sure. And so I'm very lucky that I have a solid team.
Sopheap's first assistant, Thomas, began working with him at the start of his sculpting career in 2004.
ហើយមានគេទទួលស្គាល់គឺថាគឺការងារគាត់ល្បីអត់មានឆ្លាក់អត់មានគូវាមានលក្ខណៈពិសេសត្រង់ណាបានជាគេចាប់អារម្មណ៍ខ្លាំងណាស់
We're going to take this one down. That is beautiful. He is involved in every aspect of the making of the work. He's a maker. I mean, as a sculptor, he's very interested in every aspect of the material. You can really sense the detail and the human hand in every little element of his sculptures. So even when I'm cutting, I don't want to mess with, I don't want to ruin this, so I'm careful. I don't want to damage the bamboo. And that's the other thing about cutting your own bamboo is you can choose. You want to save that so you don't want to damage it. But if you buy bamboo from the depot, when they cut this, usually they just go like this. And then they cut this part as well, so.
After the bamboo is chopped from the tree, the stalk is cut. The joints are levelled, the pieces are split, the strands are shaved and ready to be woven into the sculpture.
Rattan and bamboo are incredibly difficult to work with because he would need to strip down the individual strands and really make them pliant before he shapes them.
As Sopheap's work developed over time, his forms became more refined.
His mid-period installations were very elaborate and quite spectacular. His techniques were clearly improving and he was able to work with the materials.
Sopheap's detailed and delicate work, raft and compound, were inspired by the connections to his environment and shapes around him. In 2008, Sopheap and more than 3,000 families were evicted from their homes near Buenkak Lake to make room for a development project.
Even in the year 2000, the countryside is full of these war materials. You still see skeletons of tanks and helicopters, and they go through a factory process, recycling, whatever. And they come back as wires and nails and rebar. So that was a connection I made. The war material become the building material. But then there's also symbolically, like, a city is built, but then old buildings get destroyed. These are just kind of issues that were in my mind.
It was a really powerful evocation of this sense of urban development and displacement, but also the fact that the city was really just floating on very unstable ground. And then he developed that further in the compound installation, which was this phenomenal cityscape that filled a room. And it was a modular piece as well, so the different elements could be reconfigured in different ways. So it was constantly kind of evolving depending on where it was being shown.
Connecting to his country, creating from his land, and working with his hands gave Sopheap the freedom that he craved.
I feel like a butterfly. I feel like I'm fluttering around. I work 12 hours a day, 13 hours a day. I mean, I was the happiest I've ever been. And, you know, you spend like 6 weeks making one sculpture. Obviously, that's a beautiful kind of freedom.
Immersed in his world of beauty and freedom, Sopheap's work continues to develop. Coming up next, we take a look at how he cooks his own paint. And we show you Sopheap's new groundbreaking paintings. Cambodia's Sopheap Pich burst onto the international stage with his bamboo and rattan sculptures. His childlike imagination and his addiction to crafting is what makes his art stand out amongst his peers. Just as his technique of processing the material has evolved, so has his art. Keeping to his philosophy of non-wastage and using locally sourced materials, in 2010, Sopheap started making his grid paintings.
I was very influenced by artists such as Brancusi, for example, all these very sort of stark modernist grids. But by using rattan, by using hessian, burlap, bamboo, he's working with materials that are found around him.
I like the grid, that it's kind of anybody's technique, you know? The grid kind of belongs to anybody. I don't treat my painting like a painting. I treat my painting like a sculpture. Like all my sculpture, you can see everything. Transparency, like that way of thinking. Seemingly, from a distance, you see it as a solid surface, but it's not. It's got a lot of holes in it. You can peer through to the back and stuff like that.
He uses burlap from his local market to patch over the grids.
I want the story of how it's made to be part of the work, too. It's made with this. It's made this way.
He's covered the burlap with earth that he's collected from around the country, so it's very much grounded, literally, in the environment around him. So they're a really interesting play on the sense of a minimalist or a geometric abstract painting being kind of non-representational into something that's incredibly rich and filled with information about Cambodian life, society, environment.
I find that to be a very interesting thing to use. It's things that have a kind of personality, you know? Look at this one here. This is pretty cool. Well, look at it. It's got character. Some modern artists cannot even make work this interesting. And this is done with no intention of it being interesting. You know, what people throw away, what people don't consider important, we think it's important.
Sticking by his principles of no shortcuts, Sopheap makes his own charcoal paint out of beeswax. He travelled to the Rattan province in northern Cambodia to collect this pure, raw beeswax.
I love the smell. It's that beautiful, sweet smell of honey. And just the color. You just can't beat it.
The beeswax is boiled and the charcoal is then mixed into the recipe.
This is the same charcoal that we cook with. It's wood charcoal. It's completely natural. I love this color. I've never made a black oil painting. I never had any intention to. But I can say I love this charcoal and wax mixture.
His work is very much about a sense of play, a sense of discovery, and a sense of making. He's a maker.
With the mixture that he has cooked, Sopheap then applies it onto the canvas.
It's a very physical process. It's not something you do with a small brush. So it doesn't feel like painting to me. It feels like house painting. When it comes to my own work, everything is a kind of surprise. If I think I've gotten somewhere and I think I've been there before and I haven't progressed further than that, I know that work is not done.
Sopheap continues to surprise us with his most recent bamboo strips and natural pigment paintings.
You ask yourself, well, what happens if you stick a piece of bamboo onto some paint and you put on a piece of paper? You say, well, I don't know. So you do it, and you find out.
With his devoted set of tools, his bamboo stick, a piece of paper, and red iron oxide, he adds one new ingredient, music, and lets his trusted bamboo stick do the rest of the work.
It makes perfect sense to me. It refined my way of thinking. I think my work is very intuitive, unplanned. It demands patience. You have to enjoy working this way to make this kind of work. Sort of meditative and slow. Looking closely and trying to go in a little deeper inward.
Painting, I believe, is something that carries an element of nostalgia for him, coming back to those days when he was still struggling to find his voice as an artist. And I think maybe it's that time in his career when he wants to revisit an earlier chapter and see how differently he might do that today.
Sopheap's works are full of intricate details, subtle connections, and are circular in nature. From his early paintings and simple forms to his complex geometric shapes and abstract paintings, they all connect to his most recent sculpture, a simple flower.
A kid will not go to my grid and say, wow, what is that? What does it mean? A kid will come to the flower and say, what is that flower? Maybe it doesn't have any meaning other than that. And maybe that's okay. You don't have to make a flower that makes sense.
The cycles in Sopheap's work are reflected in his life. It took his father, the man who was responsible for teaching him how to work with his hands, 30 years to return to Cambodia.
He says, so son, you're just making baskets. People are paying money for this, you know? I said, yeah, I know, it's crazy. It's a really crazy thing, you know?
There's been an incredible interest in Sopheap's work from around the world, and I think that it is made in a way that moves across artistic forms, it moves across artistic languages.
He's been extremely successful in marrying a vernacular idiom, which is his use of indigenous materials, with a very accessible international visual art language. And I think this really is why he's so successful in the art world today.
It comes out of this kind of very deep kind of part of yourself where it resonates. There's a certain beauty and aesthetic that you're drawn to. And for each person, that becomes quite a different experience.
In art, you are adding something special or unique to other people's lives. I'm thinking I'm doing something useful with my time.
Brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.